evening, everyone. We're going to be starting momentarily. Just going to wait for folks to file in from the waiting room. So we'll get started in about 30 seconds or so. But while we wait, I do want to thank the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover for partnering with us and co-sponsoring tonight's event. And I also want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for providing financial support for tonight's event. So again, thank you to the North Andover Library and the Friends of the Tewksbury Library. I think we're going to have a few more folks join us. As an icebreaker, no obligation, don't feel like you have to if you're not comfortable doing so. But for those who are, let us know in the chat tonight where you're joining us from. So feel free to type in your current city or town. It's always a fun way to break the ice. So let us know in the chat where you're joining us from. We'll keep an eye on the chat. So a couple of logistical things I wanted to mention. I am recording tonight's event. The recording is just going to capture my video and John's video. No one from the audience will be seen, but I will be recording tonight's event just so you're aware. Everyone who is on the Zoom call tonight will be receiving an email from me tomorrow morning with a link to a feedback survey. Please take 60 seconds and fill out that survey. Let me know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events here at the library. I did want to quickly plug our next Black History Month program. We sort of have a large series of programs this month. We're doing something very different though. This Sunday, February 21st at 2 o'clock. So Sunday at 2 o'clock. We're having a presentation called The Roots of Black Music in America. And the presenter's name is Carlos Trapp. And this is going to be half historical lecture, half live concert. And it's going to be a 100+ year journey back through time to hear and learn about the music of America's Black musical giants. The foundation of so much American music comes from Black musicians across all genres. We're going to examine those influences, and we're going to see how they've impacted the music of today and yesteryear. And this live performance will both educate and entertain music lovers and history buffs of all ages. And so that's this Sunday, February 21st at 2 o'clock. And that one is also co-sponsored by our friends at the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. And I just dropped the registration link, what do you know, into the chat. All right, I think I've said just about everything I'm going to say. Just to set expectations, I anticipate this program lasting between 45 minutes and an hour. John will speak for roughly 30 minutes or so, and then we'll take audience questions and comments. Everyone is muted tonight. If you have a question or comment, type your comments into the comment box and type your questions into the Q&A box. And I will make sure that everything is relayed to John at the very end of the presentation during the Q&A. So we'll feel free to type questions as we go, but we won't address them until the very end. All right, let's get to the good stuff. Here we go. So tonight's presentation is called The Kidnapping Club, Slavery in the North. We often think of slavery as only a Southern American phenomenon. But in his new book, The Kidnapping Club, Wall Street, Slavery, and Resistance on the Eve of the Civil War, history professor Dr. Jonathan Daniel Wells gives the dramatic account of the fight for freedom in New York City in the 1830s, where abolitionists were locked in a deadly battle with pro-slavery New Yorkers. Join Jonathan to learn about the deep roots of slavery, capitalism, corrupt politics, policing, and the struggles of civil rights activists in the pre-Civil War North. So Jonathan Wells is a professor of history in the Department of Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. He's a social, cultural, and intellectual historian interested in the literary, cultural, and political evolution of 19th century America. He is the author and or editor of 10 books and has been invited to present his work to audiences across the US and internationally. In fact, he delivered the 2017 Lamar Lectures at Mercer University on the coming of the Civil War. And we're just thrilled to have him here tonight. So again, want to thank the North Andover Library and Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for collaborating and making this all possible. And let's give a big virtual round of applause to Jonathan for joining us here tonight. And Jonathan, you can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you, Robert, for that introduction. And thanks to both libraries, as you mentioned, for sponsoring all of this. And congratulations on what sounds like a very ambitious series of talks for Black History Month. So I'm sure your watchers and listeners appreciate it very much. So as Robert mentioned, published a book last year, and that's what I'm going to be talking about this evening. And what I'd like to do first, hopefully not put us all to sleep, but we really need to dip our toes a little bit into constitutional law. Don't worry, it'll just be for a moment. And that's really so that we can understand some of the broader context for what is known as the New York Kidnapping Club. So we're going to do that first. Then we're going to talk a little bit about why New York City is the focus of this book, why it was that New York City became such a hotbed of pro-South and even pro-slavery support. And this will help us to understand the context for the rise of the New York Kidnapping Club. And I'll talk more about what the club was, who were the people involved, who fought against it, how it got its name. And we'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then finally, I'll wrap up with sort of some cautionary words, because on the one hand, while the New York Kidnapping Club wanes in its power, it begins to decline in its power, and its nefarious actions begin to come to a close by the time we get to the 1840s. At that exact same time, New York City is becoming one of the most important ports in the transatlantic slave trade, which of course is patently illegal. So it's not necessarily a positive end to the story by any stretch of the imagination. And I think what we're going to learn perhaps is that some of the problems that we see today between the Black community and the police, some of the other issues that we have in terms of institutional racism, we're going to see that those are long-standing problems, not just modern issues. And then we're also going to see the ways in which cities like New York City, and we can certainly talk more about Boston in the Q&A, and the ways in which those cities were locked in their own kind of civil war before the actual American Civil War broke out in 1861. So that's kind of the roadmap for the next several minutes. So as I promised, we're going to start off with just a brief explication of why the Constitution, in some people's eyes, in the perspectives of some historians, is a document, the nation's founding document, that protects and defends American slavery. Now, we all know that by the time that the Constitutional Convention meets in the sweltering summer in Philadelphia in 1787, that there was already a growing division between the northern colonies and the southern colonies, the soon to become northern and southern states. Massachusetts had already provided for the end of slavery. Philadelphia and its state, Pennsylvania, was providing for the gradual emancipation of its last remaining enslaved people. And all throughout the Northeast and the upper Midwest, communities, states that had held on to slavery were beginning to provide for its gradual abolition. Now, one of the things we can talk more about in the Q&A is the important fact that this does not mean that Northerners believe in racial equality, or for that matter, are really caring that much about slavery. It never was as much of a part of the North's economy or society as it becomes so important to white Southerners. And so, the numbers are relatively small. The commitment is not very strong to slavery. And some of the crops, particularly cotton, that's going to be grown in the South to great prosperity, are not really feasible in the Northeast. So it's a lot sort of easier for them to do away with slavery. So by the time we get to the Constitutional Convention, we already have this problem of a divided nation. And as much as we like to revere the founding fathers, and I think sometimes we almost elevate them to a god, level of gods in our civil religion, they really didn't do a very good job of setting up a strong blueprint for the future of the country. And what I mean by that is they pretty much punt on the issue of slavery. They leave future generations to struggle with this question over how to keep a nation half free and half slave. What they do at the Constitutional Convention is, by the way, never mention slavery or slave, the word slave, specifically in the document, but there are three places where they refer to it kind of obliquely. One of them is the famous 3/5 clause that we all know. And you had this ironic situation where Northern delegates to the convention wanted enslaved people not to count at all when it came to representation in Congress. And then you had the flip side of that, which you had many white Southerners saying, yes, I know they can't, Black people can't vote, they can't hold office. The enslaved are considered property, but nonetheless, we should be able to count them as whole persons for the purposes of representation in the House of Representatives. So that was one compromise. The other compromise that I'll mention briefly is the end of the transatlantic slave trade. So one of the pieces of that document, the Constitution says, for 20 years, Congress can't do anything to mess with transatlantic slavery. So for 20 years after the Constitution is ratified, people are allowed to come in from Africa. They are allowed to transport, of course, kidnap, forcibly remove men, women, and children from West Africa in particular, and take them as enslaved people into the United States. At 20 years, Congress can, if it wants to, abolish that. And actually, that's what happens. In 1808, 1809, in fact, Congress does outlaw the transatlantic slave trade, which makes the later involvement of New York City in that trade all the more nefarious. Finally, for our purposes, I want to mention the Fugitive Slave Clause. And in fact, the document, as I mentioned, doesn't refer to slaves by name. It doesn't refer to slavery by name. But it does say fugitives from service. And that can only mean people who somehow manage under great stress and against great odds and at great personal risk, manage to free themselves from slavery in Virginia or Maryland, or perhaps farther to the west in Kentucky, and make it to a free state. And there were a lot of different ways that enslaved people escaped. We don't know how many exactly. Unfortunately, we don't have any good hard numbers. By nature, of course, it's a secretive activity, right? The act of emancipating yourself, running away. But as best we can determine, tens of thousands of people are fleeing slavery, either walking across the border at night, hiding whenever an approaching slave patrol might be around the corner. Later on, hitching rides on railroad cars or ships. And we know that this is a pretty important part of the Black experience, because that's why we have to have a fugitive slave clause in the Constitution that says if you do make it to a free state or a free city, that does not mean you're free. On the contrary, that city, whether it's Boston, Detroit, New York, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, they have a constitutional obligation to return you to your master. And that is the part of the Constitution that sets up essentially decades of the pursuit of runaways. One of the things I'm going to argue tonight in the limited time that we have, and I can certainly elaborate on it in the Q&A, is that in fact, the American Civil War was caused by fugitive slaves, the self-emancipated. That was the reason we had a civil war. In fact, one of the things I think is really crucial to understand is that if Black people were okay with enslavement, right? If the lie of white slavery was true, that somehow Black people were perfectly comfortable and at home and enjoying their lives as enslaved property, then none of this would have happened because they wouldn't have run away. And it's the act of running away that makes a mockery of this supposed border between freedom and slavery and forces generations of white politicians in Congress and in the White House to somehow continue to operate a country that is half free and half slave. It's an impossible task, I believe. And that's what I meant when I said the constitutional founders really punted. They really didn't make any helpful decisions when it came to American slavery. They left that matter for later generations to deal with. And it's something that the American political system very clearly is unable to deal with. And that's why we have a civil war. So all of this is the background for my book, which is the story of New York City. And, you know, I think many of us really value modern New York in many ways. It is like Boston, you know, it's politically progressive, it's tolerant, it's multicultural, it's pluralistic. And I think in some ways that's some issues that we value in our urban areas today. But the history of New York City has a much darker, much bleaker past. And that's what I write about in the book. And in fact, New York City is the most pro-South, pro-slavery city north of the Mason-Dixon line. And that's quite a statement, but it's one I think warrants the depiction of this period. New York City is so pro-South and even to some degree pro-slavery for really two primary reasons. One, it is very tied into the Southern cotton trade. And as you know, in the early decades of the 1800s, the American South is becoming one of the most important producers of cotton in the world. And all of that cotton that is harvested, grown, picked by enslaved labor has to be baled up, and then it's taken to port cities around the South, New Orleans, Norfolk, Charleston. And those bales of cotton, those tens and eventually hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton are going to be turned from raw material into fine linens and clothing and beautiful curtains. And that is going to be done in places like the Lowell textile mills, which I know for many of you is near and dear to your heart, and also to other manufacturing enterprises in New England. It's also going to go over the Atlantic to Liverpool and Manchester. If you go to Liverpool, England today, one reason might be perhaps to sort of relish the origins of the Beatles. But you'll also see in Liverpool in the UK today, a museum dedicated to American slavery. And at first, you might think, well, that's odd. Why on earth would that be here? But when you realize that so many textile manufacturers benefited from slave-grown cotton, then you see the rationale. And the transfer of all of these bales of cotton from raw materials grown by enslaved labor to finished products, that is all facilitated by Wall Street. And Wall Street at this point in American history is kind of an umbrella term. It's kind of a symbol, right? It isn't the powerful Wall Street that we know today. But nonetheless, it's a really good shorthand because the merchants, the bankers, the insurance companies, that are in operation immediately in the vicinity of Wall Street and Lower Manhattan are the ones that are prospering tremendously off of the cotton trade. And New York City, white New Yorkers are very much aware the fact that their wealth and their power and the growing sway of this metropolis, which is quickly becoming one of the world's great global financial capitals, is in no small part based on the cotton trade and enslaved labor. So because of that, New Yorkers are very protective of the South. They're very protective of trade with the South. And they're even very defensive when it comes to questioning slavery. So that's one major reason why New York is the focus of this book. The other one is closely tied to the first, and that is the Democratic Party in this period of American history is the reactionary party when it comes to race. And the Democrats dominate New York City politics all throughout much of the 19th century, not just before the Civil War. And so that pro-democratic sentiment, which is sort of localized or focused on Tammany Hall and its political machine, which relies on the Irish working class for its Democratic Party support, it is overwhelmingly committed to defending slavery, defending the Union, defending the constitutional compromises over slavery, which, by the way, has made New York prosperous. The constitutional framework is the umbrella under which New York is becoming wealthy and powerful. So for those two reasons, New York City is a very dangerous place for African Americans. And there are not that many living there. Of course, we know that not until the 20th century will we see large numbers of Black Southerners leaving the region in the first Great Migration and the second Great Migration, and populating cities like where I am right now, which is Detroit, but also other cities across the Midwest and Northeast. New York City only had about 16,000 African Americans before the Civil War. And that's out of a population of 300 plus. So they're a small 1 or 2% population of the city. But nonetheless, they are establishing amazing, vibrant, vigorous neighborhoods and communities all across Brooklyn and Manhattan. One of them, you may know, is Seneca Village, which is a very lively, prosperous Black neighborhood that was wiped out later on to create Central Park. But despite the fact that Black families are creating their own neighborhoods and their own schools and working hard to provide for themselves and their families, nonetheless, they experience an extremely precarious, very fragile freedom in New York City. And this is what sets the stage for the New York Kidnapping Club. So it's not really a social club. People who are in that group they know each other. They see each other all the time, but they're not really an organized group. But boy, are they an effective machine at making life miserable for New York City's Black population. One of the leaders of this New York Kidnapping Club is a couple of police officers, one named Daniel Nash and the other named Tobias Boudinot. And they roam the cities, they roam the alleyways and streets of Lower Manhattan, and they roam the wharves and docks all around the Battery of Southern Manhattan and along the East River and the Hudson River. And they are in search of anybody that they can claim to be a runaway. Do they care whether that person is in fact Joe Smith, who ran away from Virginia in 1832, or somebody who had been born into freedom in New York City and had lived there for 30 years? They do not. And that's why they are called the Kidnapping Club. And particularly at the height of their horrific activities in the 1830s, they are able to arrest people on the streets for being so-called runaways, taken before the city recorder, another member of the New York Kidnapping Club, a guy named Richard Riker, who unfortunately for the city's Black people serves as pretty much judge and jury as to whether somebody is in fact a runaway or is not a runaway. And within hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, Boudinot and Nash were able to round up people, take them before Riker, and ship them off to Southern slavery before their families even realized they're missing. For much of the 1830s, this group, Boudinot, Nash, Riker, another judge named Samuel Betts, a lawyer named Fontaine H. Pettis. How's that for a good 19th century name? Fontaine Pettis was a lawyer originally from Virginia, but he moves to New York City. And his whole practice as a lawyer is centered around recapturing runaways. And he sends ads, classified ads down to the South that are published in the newspapers that say, I will track down your runaways. All you have to do is send $20 and include a minute description of the person you're looking for, and I will be on the hunt for these individuals. So the entire political system of New York City, dominated by the Democratic Party and its reactionary sentiments on race, the legal system, including the Southern District of New York, the economic system, they are all arrayed against the interests of Black lives. And that's what allows the New York Kidnapping Club to pretty much operate with impunity all throughout the 1830s. But it wasn't without significant opposition. And in fact, there's one person who is, for lack of a better term, the hero of this story, a guy by the name of David Ruggles, who deserves, I think, to be much better known than he is today. He was, in effect, the Frederick Douglass of pre-Civil War New York City. And he is a journalist, and he publishes a newspaper called The Mirror of Liberty. And in the pages of this magazine, newspaper that he publishes, he specifically names the actors that he sees as part of the New York Kidnapping Club. And in fact, he's the one that slaps them with that label, the New York Kidnapping Club. He calls out Riker, Boudinot, Nash, Pettis, Betts, others by name in this newspaper, and he details in incredibly specific ways his interactions with them, Ruggles' attempts to throw a wrench into their nefarious activities. Ruggles also records in minute detail his encounter with slave traders and ship's captains. And his efforts to record this for posterity is in some ways how I was able to recreate these events for the book. And if you want, in the Q&A, we can talk about, one or two examples of this when Boudinot and Nash sort of seize on a specific victim. One of the most harrowing and difficult stories is the story of little Henry Scott, who's only 7 years old when he is arrested along with his father for being a runaway slave. And so Ruggles is an amazing person. He's an imperfect hero in some ways. And if you want to learn more about him, you can certainly turn to the kidnapping book. You could also turn to a biography of Ruggles that's been published by my colleague and friend, Graham Hodges. And this biography, David Ruggles, really delineates the ways in which he is both a hero, but also, a flawed human being. I mean, he's an agitator, right? He doesn't always make nice the way that Victorian society expected its population, particularly its Black people, to engage in. And so he often rubs people the wrong way, including some of his fellow Black activists in New York City. But nonetheless, he is amazing. He seems like he's everywhere at once, with his ear to the ground, always on the search for instances of racial injustice particularly the activities of the Kidnapping Club. So while Boudinot and Nash and Riker and the New York Kidnapping Club are really the villains of this story, the heroes are equally important and certainly inspiring. And chief among them is David Ruggles. Now, what really brings to an end the activities of the New York Kidnapping Club is the institution of jury trials in the 1840s in cases of accused runaways. So no longer, or at least it's more difficult, can Boudinot and Nash or other police officers or slave catchers from Virginia come into New York City, arrest somebody, take them before Riker, and in a mere few hours turn a free person into an enslaved person. Now, according to New York state law, this can only be done when a jury has been impaneled and where each side, both sides, get a chance to lay out the evidence. And it's interesting in that, you know, I think today in our politics right now in 2021 and in the last, you know, probably mostly half century, we've come to associate rural areas quite rightly with conservatism when it comes to politics. And American cities, whether they're in the South, the West, the Midwest, or the Northeast, tend to be more progressive. Well, in this period of American history, particularly when it came to New York State and New York City, it's the complete opposite. New York City is the one that's overwhelmingly conservative, even reactionary when it comes to issues of civil rights and the protection of Black lives. And it's really upstate New York legislators who are the ones who institute the jury trials. So by the time we get to the 1840s, the New York Kidnapping Club is on the decline. Unfortunately, we don't get a happy ending because at that same moment, we are seeing the rise of New York City as a key port in the illegal transatlantic slave trade. And my friend John Harris just published a book about this called The Last Slave Ships, if you're interested in reading more about it. And, you know, some of them were Portuguese merchants in Manhattan, and they used a legal trade in Madeira wine as a cover for their participation in the illegal transatlantic slave trade. And New York, along with Havana and ports along the west coast of Africa, were central to the continuing of the transatlantic slave trade almost 50 years after it had been outlawed by Congress. And that's going to actually endure all the way to the Civil War, amazingly. So unfortunately, I'd like to end the story with a bit of a happy ending, a little bit of an upswing, but it's just not historically accurate. It is true that New York State goes for the Union. That's only after, by the way, New York City decides that it's going to secede from the Union, something I didn't know until I started doing research for this project, that the City Council of New York meets in early 1861 and actually votes in favor of secession. Now, they're not going to join the Confederacy. They want to establish their own independent government, but they want to leave the Union nonetheless. But once the Civil War breaks out, New York State, to a large degree, even New York City, joins the war effort on behalf of freedom and on behalf of the Union. But New York City will remain a very sort of reactionary place when it comes to Black civil rights all throughout the Civil War and afterward. You probably know about the draft riots in 1863 in July, when Irish working class mobs terrorized Black communities in Manhattan and Brooklyn. And as a result, Black people flee the city, and they really won't return to New York City in any significant way until the 1880s and 1890s. So a full generation or more after the Civil War. And the next book, by the way, I'm working on has to do with New York City, and I've been doing research for it. And all throughout the Civil War and all throughout the Reconstruction period after the war, there's a weekly newspaper that's published And it's spread all across the country, but it's centered in Lower Manhattan. And the paper has the grossly unfortunate title of the New York Weekly Caucasian. And as it suggests, this is a newspaper that spews the most despicable white supremacist rhetoric from the heart of Wall Street. So my book ends in 1861, but unfortunately, the story of New York City as a difficult place for Black people continues well after that. So I think in conclusion, the story of the New York Kidnapping Club tells us a few things. One, it tells us how seemingly intractable, certainly how long-standing the problems have been between the police forces of our cities and the Black communities they're supposed to protect. And we see that most clearly in the 1830s in New York with the Kidnapping Club. We see the pervasiveness of racism, institutional racism, and the power of discrimination, another seemingly intractable problem. And we also see the extent to which Northern communities are locked in their own civil wars long before the Civil War itself breaks out. So I think, we're left with, kind of a difficult, almost bleak understanding of the lengths of America's dealing with slavery and racism and discrimination. But on the bright side, and for me, as I was researching this book and writing it, I really took inspiration in people like David Ruggles, other important people, including many white abolitionists in New York City, but also Black activists who we barely know: Thomas Van Rensselaer, Charles B. Ray, Sella Martin, Henrietta Ray. I mean, some of the people who were African American fighting against racial injustice during the pre-Civil War period, they're the people that I really take inspiration from and find solace in, as bleak and as dark as this story sometimes is. Thank you so much for your patience, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Great, thanks so much, John. We have a couple of questions in the chat and a couple of questions in the Q&A. And so folks, I would encourage you to get your questions in. Either box is fine. I think I'd prefer the Q&A though. And we'll take, at least 10 to 20 minutes of questions. So stick with us. So first up was asked at the very beginning. Let's see here. So Mary would like you, for those who may not know, can you please explain the 3/5 clause?
Sure, I'm happy to. So that was one of the three places in the Constitution that refers to slavery. The Fugitive Slave Clause being one, the issue of the transatlantic slave trade and its future outlawing was the other, and then the third was the 3/5 clause. And as we know, the Constitution is a compromise on a lot of different levels, right? So in the Senate, whether you're populated Texas, Florida, or California, you still only get 2 senators. If you're Wyoming with more cows than people, you still get 2 senators, right? So the populated and not so populated states have that as a compromise in the Senate. The House of Representatives, though, is where the population is, as you all know, calculated. And that's where the most populated states, like California, have the most representatives in Congress. And that is all decided by the census that's taken every 10 years. And that's where the 3/5 clause comes into play. So if I am a slave owner and I have 1,000 enslaved people in my plantation in South Carolina, they will count for 3/5 of what 1,000 white people would count as for purposes of representation. So it's a very, weird, unfortunate, even in some ways backwards way of dealing with this issue of freedom and slavery. But as I said in the outset, the interesting thing is you have white Northerners saying, well, they shouldn't count at all, right? They can't vote, they can't hold office. Why are we counting Black people as the equivalent of citizens for the purposes of representation in Congress? And then you had white Southerners saying, But we want to count them all because the more we count, the more representatives we'll have in the House. So that's where the 3/5 clause really came into play. And of course, that was struck down when the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, ending American slavery.
Next question. Were German Jews around in any prominent way during this time? If so, can you talk about the positioning of German Jews in 19th century New York discourse around anti-Black policing? Were there any coalitions between Ashkenazi Jews, I don't know my tribes, I apologize, and Black Americans you know of?
No, the Ashkenazi and the Jewish population really doesn't come until much later. Now, there are important, Jewish people all across the country, including, by the way, in the South. Some of the most important Jewish communities were in Charleston, South Carolina. And one of the first Jewish members of Congress is Judah Benjamin, who is a pro-slavery Jewish senator from the South. So there are Jewish people sort of scattered in pockets around the country, but they're not really playing a significant role yet in the history of New York. That'll come at the end of the 19th century and certainly by the 20th century for sure.
Additional question, what grant or previous study prompted this historical inquiry?
Oh, that's a formal question, isn't it? So really, I started reading more and more about the fugitive slave crisis, as it's called by historians. And, historians have known about this for a long time. A lot of important Black historians have written on the issue of runaways. Richard Blackett, who is a professor at Vanderbilt, has done some really important work on this subject. New York's Andrew Delbanco from Columbia has done an important book on this. Eric Foner's written about it. But I really wanted to learn more about this group called the New York Kidnapping Club that I was catching snippets of. So I think the first time I heard of it was in the biography of David Ruggles that I mentioned earlier by Graham Hodges. But there's also some references to the New York Kidnapping Club in Leslie Harris's great book on slavery in New York City and its history. And I kept seeing references to him, but without much development. I really wanted to delve into that quite a bit more because it seemed very odd that in the place where sort of capitalism is running rampant, sort of the city that we see as America's great metropolis, not only today, but back in the 19th century, was in fact a much more complicated place when it came to its Black residents. So that's really why I wanted to take on this project. And it was really just, sort of following paths and being curious.
Great. Martha would like to know what type of legal representation were Blacks able to get in the jury trials?
Yeah, great question. And here again, there's some real heroes in this story. One of them is a white lawyer. His name is Horace Mann, M-A-N-N. And he takes a lot of these cases on pro bono. In some cases, if he gets paid. A group of New York abolitionists, both Black and white, called the Committee of Vigilance. They raise money for the defense of accused runaways. So, there are, unfortunately, plenty of other New York attorneys who are more than happy to defend slave owners and to defend slave catchers who are there in court to claim that so-and-so is a runaway and present proof to that effect. So, there's no shortage of lawyers on either side, but there are some pretty heroic people like Horace Mann who really take on these cases and fight really hard to win freedom for people. And the interesting thing about these cases is that both sides present kind of trumped up evidence in retrospect. I mean, you have white slave owners saying, they bring in witnesses from North Carolina or Georgia or Texas into New York courts and say, oh yeah, I knew, this slave, he was born in Virginia to a slave mother, and then he ran away 4 or 5 years ago. And I've always known that he was a slave. But then you have Black people in the community who are coming to the defense of the accused and saying, no, 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 I've known this guy since 1820. There's no way he could be the runaway slave you claim him to be. So there's a certain part of performance and theater to all of this, but at least it's slowing the process down. At least now you just can't whisk somebody away and sell them into slavery in a matter of hours.
Thomas has several questions. First off, how did the club collect the $20 when some are free? Meaning there could not be a Southern slaveholder to pay for the kidnapping. So also, who paid for the shipping of the blacks? Did it come out of the $20? And how were the blacks shipped via rail, boat, or something else?
So the $20 I mentioned was just a retainer. Mm-hmm. So that was Fontaine Pettis saying to Southerners, send me a retainer and I will search for your accused runaways. And, if you've ever seen the movie or read the memoir, 12 Years a Slave, you know how easy it is to turn somebody from a free person into a piece of property. It takes very little in America's legal system to make that happen. For Solomon Northup, his free papers are taken away. And remember that if you're Black in America in the pre-Civil War period, you're pretty much automatically assumed to be a slave. So it's incumbent upon you to present your free papers to indicate your free status. And by the way, if your listeners or watchers want to see some examples of these, you can go to the University of Pittsburgh Library's website, which has a really cool online exhibit of freedom papers. And all it takes is one slave trader, in Richmond or New Orleans or anywhere else, to receive this person, present them on the auction block, and within a matter of days, somebody is declared to be enslaved, and their free status is completely erased. The other way this works financially, well, a couple of ways, really quickly. So Boudinot, Tobias Boudinot, who's the New York police officer I mentioned, kind of the arch villain of the New York Kidnapping Club, he actually acts as a broker, almost like a slave trader himself. Because when he'll say, I'm arresting Joseph Smith for being a runaway. And then he sends a letter to a plantation owner in Georgia and say, I have your slave here, but if you send me $200, I'll make sure he gets back to you. Or he says, we can raise $500 here in New York. I'm going to take a cut of 20%, but if you'll take the rest, then we'll declare him no longer a slave. I mean, there's so many intricate, but nonetheless, really, unfortunately, effective ways that money can be made out of this process. The other quick thing is, Boudinot and Nash are perusing the newspapers. All across the country, there are runaway slave ads in newspapers that say, for $30 or $50 reward for information on my runaway slave, I'll send you that reward if you'll give me the information you have. So there's lots of ways to make money, unfortunately, in this process.
And John, you were asking me before we started what sort of other programs had we run this month, and we actually had a program last week on how the press perpetuated slavery, and the focus was on those advertisements. I'll try to find the video and drop it in the chat. So Thomas has another multi-part question for you, but it's a good one. I'll just read it verbatim here. Did he get paid after the fact, or would he get paid? Would it be sort of a kidnapping on order, like a purchase order almost? How would the kidnappers know where to ship a person to what southern ports when plantations were located far inside land areas? Can we assume slaveholders picked up the load at a southern port and took them inland?
Sure, they might have, but of course, we have slavery in all of the southern ports, right? I mean, there are a lot of slaves in New Orleans, a lot of slaves in Norfolk, a lot of slaves in Charleston. So the big plantations are inland, but that by no means, is the limits of American slavery. It's everywhere in big cities as well as sort of remote areas. So, what all that had to happen was a kidnapped person would be placed in the hands of a slave trader. And my friend and colleague Joshua Rothman is coming out with a book pretty soon, and may even already be out, about slave trading as a business. These are companies, and their whole purpose is to buy and sell enslaved people. And all you have to do is hand them, one of these people. You get a kickback, $25, $50, whatever it is, and they have easy means of turning these people into enslaved property. So I'd like to say it was difficult. I'd like to say it was problematic, but it's anything but. And I just had my students watch 12 Years a Slave, the movie, and they absolutely really enjoyed it. I mean, obviously it's an extremely painful and difficult movie to watch. Enjoy may not be the right word, but they learned a lot from it. Let me put it that way. And back to this issue really quickly, you mentioned about newspapers, Robert. There's a newspaper in New York City. It's called the Journal of Commerce. And it's it's like the Wall Street Journal of its day. The Journal of Commerce is, one of these mouthpieces in the press that is promoting the South, defending slavery, defending the cotton trade, in favor of the Union, questioning abolitionists, against Black civil rights. And it comes out, several times a week. So it's also a very powerful voice in favor, from the perspective of the press, to cheapening Black lives.
Thank you, Jonathan. And I did drop the video in the chat, and also information about the featured speaker. And I'm going to say last call for questions. We have a good amount of questions in the Q&A still to go. So if anyone has any additional questions, get them into the Q&A, and then we're going to do a hard stop, I'd say in about 10 minutes or so. Nancy wants to know, did Nash and company become wealthy with this kidnapping activity?
Yeah, good question. It's funny, Boudinot and Nash were always in financial trouble. I mean, and that may be one of the reasons why, they so desperately are trying to broker slave trades. They're trying to capture victims and take them into slavery. They're trying to collect reward money. I found evidence that, in fact, Boudinot is constantly being sued for debt, for non-payment of debt. And at one point, basically, his landlord takes all of his furniture and sells it because Boudinot can't pay his own bills. So I don't think it's right to say that they became rich, but they certainly saw this as a way to keep themselves financially afloat to some degree. So they had every incentive to do that.
Obviously, your book focuses on New York City. Letitia wants to know, was this system and these attitudes common throughout the North?
Yeah, good question. Yes, essentially is the answer to that question. Again, my good friend, Richard Bell, historian at the University of Maryland, has written a book, came out a couple of years ago, called Stolen. And it is about Philadelphia. And the same kinds of things that I'm describing in my book were happening in Philadelphia as early as the 18-teens and 1820s. And the ringleader in this case, is a woman, a slave trading, slave catching, kidnapping woman named Patty Cannon. And she lived on the Delmarva Peninsula, and she and her family members, the male members of her family, they would sneak into Philadelphia and they would offer, a Black child, maybe a teenage boy, a quarter if he would help unload produce into, the basement of a store. Well, lo and behold, children who are, of course, as we know, easily manipulated and often tricked, would find themselves shackled in the basement as a result. And they would be sold into Southern slavery. Again, very easy. All you got to do is put them aboard a ship, get a corrupt ship's captain, and they were everywhere. A corrupt ship's captain to take this young man and take them from Philadelphia down to wherever, Charleston, and put them in the hands of a slave trading company. And there you were. And oftentimes that was the end of the story. I mean, Solomon Northup, one of the things that's remarkable about his true story is that he is able to regain his freedom. Now, it happens after 12 years of tremendous suffering, but nonetheless, he's sort of this 1 in a million instance in which he's able to win his freedom back. Most people who will be kidnapped or taken into Southern slavery will never see their liberty again until the 13th Amendment. So yes, it did happen in Philadelphia. It happened all across cities in the country.
Gail would like to know, was there no internal police policies against their policemen kidnapping blacks?
No, is the short answer. No internal police policies. In fact, the police force, there are laws on the books in New York State that say you can't just kidnap people. But it's one thing to have a law on the books, and it's another thing to have it enforced, and nobody's enforcing it. And so, in terms of the white legal system, nobody is really fighting against Boudinot or Nash. On the contrary, they're all on his side because, again, they know where New York City's wealth and power is coming from. It's coming from the cotton trade with the South. So, the police forces are, you can hardly call them that. It's so different from what we think of as organized police forces today that it barely warrants the name police force. In fact, neither Boudinot nor Nash, who eventually will become a U.S. Marshal, wear uniforms. So if you're a Black person, sweeping the streets, sweeping Broadway in 1835, and you're arrested by Boudinot, you can't even be sure you're being arrested by a so-called legitimate authority. So, you can just imagine the terror that these guys struck in the hearts of Black communities. And there's really not much in the way of police laws or police regulations or anything that's going to be stepping in the way of the activities of the Kidnapping Club, at least not until much later.
Last set of questions will go to Sharon. And Sharon, it looks like you attended last night's program. I hope you enjoyed it. Just due to time constraints, Sharon, I think I'm just going to ask your first set of questions. So Sharon would like to know, what is your perspective of today's current events related to racism, and what is your outlook for making progress in addressing the issue of racism?
Yeah, good question, and a good one to end on. So when I was writing the Kidnapping Club book, and I was finishing sort of the last chapters and the epilogue, that was, it seems like a century ago, but it was only a few years ago. And Ta-Nehisi Coates, the great new American critic and journalist and writer, was testifying before Congress about reparations. And it seems like, that conversation has completely gotten lost over the last few years as we've dealt with the end of the Trump presidency and, of course, with COVID. But I'd like to see us return to that question at some point, because in my mind, having studied this period and having written a book about, what happens to Black people in New York City, it's just one part of a broader national story in which Black people were robbed of their freedom, robbed of their property, murdered in the streets, sold into slavery. And it is, the legacy of slavery and racism that not only, sort of casts a pall over the southern half of the United States, but also over the history of the country more generally. And New York's complicity in all of this makes the story a national one, not just a regional one. And so, what form that eventually takes, whether you can even consider any kind of economic or financial compensation for the kinds of suffering that's been inflicted on generations of Black people in this country, I don't know. It's going to take people who are smarter than me to figure that out. But is the moral imperative there for some kind of compensation? Yes, I believe strongly that there is.
So Jonathan, we've hit 8 o'clock our time. So
my time too.
Your time too, great. So we'll begin to wrap up. So Jonathan, did you have any last words that you wanted to leave with the group?
Well, I'll say, if anybody wants to reach out to me, I got a really simple email address. It's John Wells, Jon, at umich.edu. You can certainly find me there or other means on the internet. So feel free to reach out if we didn't get a chance to ask your question tonight. And I will say, finally, I think it's worth saying, particularly as we're talking about at the end of this story about reparations, and about the fact that slavery is a national phenomenon and racism is a national phenomenon. It's not just a Southern issue. It's important to realize that, the purpose of all this is not to say, well, look how bad racism and slavery was in a place like New York. In other words, to somehow diminish or absolve the white South for its centuries of racial crimes. Nothing I could do or would do could diminish that. But it is, I think, important to say that it's also not a simple story of, we've got an abolitionist North and a pro-slavery South. That the story of American history is much more complicated than that. And that's what makes us sort of universally complicit as white Americans, whether we're from New York or California or South Carolina, in this larger story about racism, slavery, and segregation.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for taking your time to join us tonight. I learned quite a bit, and it seemed the audience was very engaged. So really want to thank you. I want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Library. Want to thank our partners with the Stevens Memorial Library in North Andover. Want to remind folks to look for that email tomorrow morning with the feedback survey. And please take 60 seconds, fill that out, and let us know what you thought of tonight's event. So hope to see many of you at some of our upcoming Black History Month programs. We got another 7 or so to go, and I'll include information on those programs in the email tomorrow morning. So thank you so much again, Jonathan, Professor Wells, and I hope everyone has a great night. Thanks so much. I'm going to end the call in about 10 seconds here. Make sure you check out the chat, Jonathan. People are thanking you.
Yes, everybody, you're welcome. And thanks so much, Robert, for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Great. Everyone have a wonderful night. Enjoy the snow.